Hello, I'm Kirsten Seckler. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Shatterproof. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you not familiar with Shatterproof, we are a trusted guide for those who are struggling with substance use disorder and the complexities of substance use. And so what we're doing is work that transform addiction treatment, ends addiction stigma, and educate and empower our communities. So here we are, it's January. Dry January is under the midst, and we thought we'd have a conversation today around dry January and considering your relationship with alcohol and how it impacts not just you, but those around you. So if you haven't joined the Shatterproof Dry January Challenge yet, we welcome you to join at shatterproof.org/dryjanuary to sign up. And today we're going to have a conversation with two incredible women who are known experts in this field. So first, we're going to have Dr. Suzette Glasner, who's a clinical psychologist, associate professor at UCLA, and an author of Addiction, What Everyone Needs to Know. And we also have Hilary Sheinbaum, a journalist, author as well, and lifestyle expert who literally wrote the book on Dry January, the Dry January Challenge. So I welcome both of you to our webinar today. And I really want to turn it over to you so that everyone can hear directly from you, Dr. Glasner and Hilary, just a little bit about each of you. So we'll start with you, Dr. Glasner.
Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to this discussion. It's so timely and so important. As far as my background, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I've spent much of my career in academia doing research on evidence-based treatments, developing and testing evidence-based treatments for addictions, as well as overlapping mental and physical health conditions. I'm very passionate about making these treatments accessible to everyday people, and also making all of this knowledge that we've been amassing through addiction science more accessible to people who really have a thirst for the knowledge and understanding of what addiction really is, maybe how it differentiates from what we know as substance misuse. So you don't have to have a full-blown and severe addiction to benefit from all that we've learned through addiction science about how you can change your use of substances and the ways in which substance use impacts the brain and the body and behavior. So to that end, in the spirit of making treatment more accessible, a lot of my research and my work is focused around transporting our evidence-based therapies to digital health platforms, to telemedicine, studying and really leading the rollout of these types of interventions. And I've also been pretty active as an author. My most recent book, as you mentioned, is Addiction, What Everyone Needs to Know. That was published last summer. And it's really my effort to sort of bring together all that we know from addiction science and again, make it really understandable to anyone who is curious about this topic or has a personal connection to it. How is addiction treated? How do people recover? And really dispelling a lot of the myths around addiction and its treatment, which is something I think we're going to make some inroads towards today in our conversation. My first book, which was a few years, several years before this most recent one, is the Addiction Recovery Skills Workbook, which also was an attempt from my end to take all that I've studied on evidence-based treatments for addiction and substance misuse and turn it into sort of a user-friendly guide for people who are trying to make changes to their lives. And it's used either together with a therapist or a clinician or just on your own, just to learn. So that's sort of what's been occupying my my mind space and my career over several decades. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hilary to talk about her background.
Thank you. Uh-oh. Wait, am I still? Nope, not still muted. Great. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Shatterproof, for having me. My name is Hilary Sheinbaum. I am a journalist, an author, and the founder of goingdry.co. I have been a journalist in New York City for more than 12 years, contributing to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and basically more than 60 other publications throughout my journalism career. I have 2 books on the subject of drinking less. One is called The Dry Challenge, which is a judgment-free guide to giving up alcohol for a dry January, a sober October, or any other month. And my most recent book is called Going Dry. It's a workbook, and it has more than 70 prompts really to help individuals really document how they're feeling without alcohol as social drinkers. Neither of my books are geared towards people who are looking for recovery programs. Instead, they are for people who are looking to lessen their alcohol consumption or potentially give it up forever. However, it is not to be used as medical advice. And I founded an organization called goingdry.co, which puts on events and helps curate non-alcoholic menus for businesses like bars and restaurants and hotel groups, so that they can have more inclusive offerings for their customers, whether they are, not drinking that evening or switching to a non-alcoholic beverage in between alcoholic beverages, or just for people who never drink. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm really excited to have this chat.
That's great. Thank you both for being here today. And I love your experience, your expertise, and want to thank both of you really for all the work that you're doing in the space. At Shatterproof, I mentioned that we see ourselves as that trusted guide, and we always look for evidence-based information, great people who we can bring to the forefront to have some good, conversations. And that's what we're going to do today, is have a conversation and learn from both of you and your experiences, for people who are interested in exploring the relationship with alcohol. So, Dr. Glasner, I'm going to actually start with you. Shatterproof's mission is to reverse the addiction crisis. Been doing this for 11 years. And a big part of our intention with our Dry January campaign is to bring what is considered a stigmatized topic to the forefront. We want to normalize the conversation around your relationship or people's relationship with substances, whether it be drugs or alcohol. So my question for you is, what have you found to be some of the most polarizing and misleading information that dominates public thinking about addiction? And how can something like Dry January play a role in changing public thinking?
Well, those are great questions. And it's hard to boil it down to a couple of things, but I have been thinking about this in advance of our conversation. And I think I would highlight probably 2 major misconceptions, and then we could talk about the benefits of Dry January and sort of challenging them. The first one is the notion that there's a sort of prototype of addiction that is lifelong. People have sort of an image of what does someone with addiction look like and what does their life look like. And there is this sort of, I think, very widely held misconception that people never recover from addiction. And there are so much scientific data, but in particular, I'll highlight a couple of studies that have recently really kind of clarified and challenged very clearly that notion that addiction is lifelong and people never recover. And I think there's a reason that people tend to think that, because what we see portrayed in the media around substance use and addiction is most commonly the more tragic stories, the overdoses, the overdose death trends, and those are very real problems. And it is important to highlight those through media and all the mechanisms that we have at our disposal so that people take those public health challenges seriously and work to solve them. But they're not really a realistic portrayal of what the experience of addiction is for the full range of the population that struggles with a substance use disorder. So there have been a couple of recent studies that have really shed light on the prevalence of recovery. So rather than focusing on solely the prevalence of severe addiction. What about the prevalence of recovery and remission from substance use disorders? Because, and I'm mentioning remission very deliberately, because just like cancer and other chronic illnesses, people do go into remission from a substance use disorder. They do recover from a substance use disorder. And that really runs counter to some of those stigmatized beliefs that you live with this forever and you're in and out of rehab or inpatient treatment over the long term if you're somebody who struggles with addiction, because that's really not the case. So first, there was a national study that was out of Harvard Medical School led by very esteemed colleague John Kelly. And the questions that they sought to understand was, number one, what is the proportion of the American population that has resolved or achieved remission from a substance use disorder? And then secondly, what are the different pathways that lead them to recover? And this really was a groundbreaking study, and it showed that over 22 million Americans, which constitutes over 9% of the population, report that they're living in recovery, or that they have resolved a significant problem with alcohol or drug use. And then a second study that followed that was a partnership of the CDC as well as the National Institute on Drug Abuse, found that out of the over 27 million people who have experienced a substance use disorder in their lifetimes, nearly 75% of them reported that they were in recovery or had recovered. So that's actually 3 out of every 4 people who have had a substance use disorder recover eventually. So I just want to everyone to absorb that. I mean, it's probably a kind of a shocking statistic to many people who think that this is a problem that people don't get well from. And that leads me to the second probably misconception, is that there's only one way to recover, because these studies did also evaluate how did 3 out of every 4 people achieve that. And I think the misconception is you have to go to inpatient rehabilitation, you have to go to a certain form of treatment or a certain length of treatment, or you have to view this as an all or nothing total abstinence pursuit for the long term and entirely from all substances in order to be successful. And this is where something like Dry January really has the potential to be transformative. So taking a step back, we know that a lot of people don't seek treatment because they think they're going to have to give up drinking or substance use entirely. And that is one of the primary reasons that we have such a large treatment need versus treatment receipt gap in America, where less than 10% of people who actually could benefit from treatment for a substance use disorder actually receive it. And so there are two things that I would want to highlight there in response to that misconception. Is that first, treatment is a very important pathway to success and an important pathway to recovery. As a clinical psychologist specialized in addiction, I have spent my entire career providing treatment to people in various formats and seeing the benefits of treatment really bear out in people's lives. And people who report having received formal treatment have nearly twice the likelihood of remaining in recovery over the longer term. So treatment is a really important tool. But that being said, there is a large proportion, between 46 and 60% of people, who report that they've resolved a substance use problem using methods other than professionally led treatment to support their recovery. So yes, we have evidence-based treatment tools, medications, psychotherapies. The medications help control cravings and prevent relapse, as well as the psychotherapy techniques, and I'm a big proponent of those. But there's also so many other resources that I think Hilary's going to speak to as well. The use of self-help groups, such as AA or NA, recovery support services, books and websites and tips and tricks that you can familiarize yourself with if you're entering sort of a 30-day challenge like Dry January. So it's important to keep in mind that there's not just one way to recover. And some people succeed by combining approaches like therapy, medication, and self-help group support, whereas others will really focus on one or the other. The second point is this idea that a commitment to total and long-term abstinence really shouldn't be a prerequisite for change. And this is where Dry January really has the potential to impact so many people. So I want to think kind of like around harm reduction. We know that studies show that changing alcohol use has long-term measurable benefits on well-being, quality of life, and even physical health indicators like liver function, blood pressure that can be long lasting well beyond that initial stage of abstinence. And then I also want to bring your attention to sort of what attempting something like Dry January, like you're looking at this as sort of like a temporary period, potentially, that you might extend, but you have to start somewhere, right? So thinking about what that can lead to. We know that long-term substance use behavior patterns can be the beginning of a journey towards longer term healthy relationship with alcohol can really start with something like Dry January. And we know that abstinence is a really worthwhile strategy to promote this future success. So we have research that shows that when people with an alcohol use disorder can control their drinking over a period of a couple of months, it doesn't necessarily predict that they are going to be able to sustain that controlled drinking over a longer period of time. But when they can abstain from drinking over 2 or 3 months, that early success with abstinence actually does predict longer term success. And success could mean continued abstinence. It could mean successfully controlling one's drinking over a year time frame. But if the starting point is a temporary challenge, it actually opens up the opportunity for people to be more successful in the long term. So those are some of the ways, and I'm happy to talk also about health benefits as well of a Dry January, because there are quite a few. But those are some of the ways that breaking through some of those misconceptions and opening up one's mind to the idea of a 30-day challenge can sort of pave the way towards making longer term, more sustainable changes that feel doable and that can lead to better health.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you talked about this, different pathways to, recovery, or just different, that it's not all or nothing all the time. I think that's really important. And I love how you mentioned that Dry January can be a step in that direction, and can be that exploratory thing. So thank you for that. Oftentimes, the hardest part of trying something feels daunting. Just that it's something new, something you have to start. Hilary, you are now on a year 9 consecutive Dry Januaries. Can you talk a little bit about how you started and what advice you would give folks who are just starting, who want to, try this out, or need a restart?
Yeah, I cannot believe this is my 9th Dry January because the first time I did Dry January in 2017, I really thought it was a one-time thing, and now it has become an annual celebration and definitely a bigger part of my life, and which is really exciting. But I'm going to start by taking you back into my personal history. In 2016, I was a red carpet reporter, and so that means that I covered movie premieres and album release parties and all that really fun stuff that you see on entertainment shows. I was one of those people standing on the red carpet interviewing, the Kardashians or Brad Pitt or Meryl Streep or Oprah. And it was like the time of my life in my 20s. I felt like I had my dream job, and I definitely did at the time. My job would start at 5 p.m. when I would go check into my red carpet assignment, and then sometimes go until 2 a.m. And during that span of time, either at the events or at the after parties, I was definitely permitted to drink. I was not getting drunk or, being outrageous, but if I had a glass of wine or a cocktail, it was totally kosher. And, alongside just being around in that environment for my work nights, I was also freelancing during the day, and I was primarily writing about food and beverage, including wine, beer, and spirits. So both of my jobs really entailed alcohol consumption, even at, the tiniest of levels. And certainly as a 20-something in New York City who was single and dating, going on, first dates, which often entailed grabbing a drink or going to, birthday parties or gatherings with friends or brunch or, whatever, Friday nights, I was always around alcohol. So with all of that background information, on New Year's Eve 2016, I was tipsy and texting a friend of mine who was often a +1 to these fun parties and engagements. And I proposed that we make a bet to see who could take on a dry January and completely cut out alcohol for 31 days. My friend agreed. And he still is a friend, but he definitely was always up for anything. And, was not about to get, say no to a bet. So the premise was the person who drank had to buy the person who did not drink, the winner, dinner anywhere in New York City. And I both did not want to lose because I was a freelance writer making $0. And also I'm really stubborn and I'm an Aries, so I can't lose. But with that, I won so much more than a dinner in the end. My friend ended up getting peer pressured by a girl at a bar to drink. And he, I will say that he did finally complete a dry January 5 years later, but to this day, he still will not make a bet with me. I did, however, end up writing a book called The Dry Challenge, and I dedicated it to him because without him, I definitely would not have completed my first dry January, which really set the course of my life in a different direction. I've continued to do dry January without a bet because even within that short 31-day period, I felt amazing benefits, including better sleep, just a clearer mindset, less anxiety. I just felt like happier and more upbeat, even during like the dullest, darkest, coldest month of January in New York. And I still went out. I still like saw my friends. I was just drinking, diet sodas or making up mocktail concoctions with the bartender, and asking them to, make me something nice and fruity and something, different just without alcohol. Um, so my first book, The Dry Challenge, was really the guide that I could have very much used and the things that I learned just by doing dry January without a plan. I really did not have any intention of doing dry January until, the words were coming out in my fingers via text. And so everything I learned was kind of as I was doing it and the research that I was conducting. So some of my tips would obviously be recruit a friend, as I did. I think that there is strength in numbers. And although Alejandro did not make it to the end of our dry challenge, we were, encouraging each other, definitely being able to vent to each other. We were bonded by this experience, but certainly like we both recognized how much peer pressure that there was coming from outside sources like friends and, even colleagues if we were going to a networking event, and just the really interesting and yet invasive questions that people would ask us about our lifestyles. So it was definitely a shared learning experience. So that's always my number one tip, is to recruit a friend. Doesn't have to be a bet. If a bet is motivating to you, then absolutely go for it. Secondly, I would say be kind to yourself. I think that a lot of people think that dry January is a all or nothing situation. And the reality is that like alcohol is everywhere, and it's not just part of, being a social butterfly or like going to a bar. It's really part of dating. Like nobody asks, do you want to go on a date? They say, let's grab a drink. It's part of going to sports games, which are obviously supposed to be about athleticism and health, and yet everybody is drinking a beer. And it's part of, dining and networking and these very memorable big celebrations like weddings. People get upset if there isn't an open bar. And it's also part of, mourning a loss, and for a lot of people, just a ritual at the end of, a day. So be kind to yourself. If you have a drink, if you have, this is if you're doing a dry January and you're a social drinker, I always say, just start again the next day. Call it a 1-drink January, call it a damp January, and just finish off strong. Another big tip that I have is to try non-alcoholic beverages as long as they are not triggering to you. I think that sometimes encouraging people to drink like a seltzer water is definitely hydrating, but it doesn't taste like the same thing that you're expecting. So if you drink a non-alcoholic wine or a non-alcoholic beer, there are really great options now. For non-alcoholic wines, there's a brand called Gießen 0%. There's also Mianetto, which makes sparkling wine. There's also Free Spirits, which makes cocktails that are non-alcoholic, and Fluere that makes non-alcoholic spirits that you can, make your own at home. And sometimes, it's as easy as popping open an Olipop and maybe adding a few other extra ingredients so that you're having that, healthier beverage with benefits, and you're obviously not getting a buzz. So those are a few of my tips. There are very, very many more in the books that I've written. But I think that, it's also when you're doing a dry January or you're cutting back on alcohol or eliminating it completely, it's really about being in those social situations and doing things that you enjoy to encourage like socialization. So, for example, when I started doing dry Januaries, I would actually take dates to fitness classes, because I knew that if it was going to move forward past a first or second date, even if we, were to go to a bar, eventually I would want to spend my weekends, going to the gym or exercising or spending time and seeing if this individual had the same interests as I did. So I think, it's a great opportunity to showcase not just with potential partners, but also with friends, what your interests are, and really bond over that. But yeah, I think that certainly, if you are doing a dry January now, even if you've had, 1 drink, I think that that's okay. Like, it's not about being perfect. It's just about, reducing your alcohol consumption altogether, and yeah, and just continuing on.
Thank you. And thanks for sharing your journey through this. And I love that you had, a friend who you did this with. And I have to ask though, uh, next year is the 10-year anniversary, 10 year. Do you have any plans for your 10th dry January?
Great question. I haven't made any plans yet. I think now that you mention it, I'll probably have to throw a party, a non-alcoholic one, of course, and maybe I'll get, some friends. Some friends now, they do dry Januaries, but maybe I'll get like 10 friends to do it, and we'll all, have a big celebration.
Great. All right. Well, we're gonna shift to discussion. I do want to let our participants know that they can ask any questions in the Q&A. Um, but my first topic, Hilary, you raised, which I thought is so important. This there's so many social pressures around drinking. Alcohol's everywhere. It's you know in the restaurants. People are getting together. I mean, I'm, even in my own neighborhood, I feel like anytime there's a gathering, it's always around alcohol. Um, and I have myself experienced that awkward question of, why aren't you drinking? Um, so we don't create these awkward moments. What can we do as a society to be a little bit more sober inclusive for those in recovery? And I'd love to hear both from Hilary and Dr. Glasner on this, because I think it's really important that we're not just thinking about what is the person doing to not have a relationship with alcohol, but what can we all do to make sure it's comfortable for those who choose not to have a relationship with alcohol.
I think that personally, when I'm hosting individuals in my home or, at an event, I obviously host events without alcohol, but I think it's important to have options for those individuals. I think it's important to have like tasty options, not just a juice or, maybe like a soda water, but also lean into maybe having a non-alcoholic cocktail or non-alcoholic wine. And I also just think the most important thing is like not to ask people what they're drinking or question it or ask why. I think it's as simple as saying, these are the options that we have, and letting someone choose, and not questioning, what their choices are, if they're, saying no to booze. So, yeah, I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, I think those are some great suggestions. And I think I'll sort of add to that, by sort of promoting the idea of like self-reflection around one's own responses to other people who aren't drinking. Um, I I didn't mention at the beginning, but I have a podcast, the Dr. Suzette Glasner podcast, and I talk about different topics around addiction and recovery. And one of them that I covered in my last one was this idea of kind of what you were describing, of like a sober stigma, which is sort of the way people are viewed when they decline alcohol at a party or a social event. Um, and there was actually some research on this topic in recent years around like, why is that? Like, why is it people who are making the choice to not drink in a social setting where other people are drinking are subject to this kind of like judgmental experience from the drinker or the person who's enjoying alcohol at that event? What is that really all about for the person who is drinking? Like, what is it evoking for that person when somebody around you is not doing the same thing as you? And so they did these kind of like qualitative interviews, and they of the individuals who were being judgy towards other people who were not drinking, and they identified a couple of different themes, and all of it comes back to the way that they were feeling about themselves, really. And for the person who is trying to achieve this challenge or more long-term sobriety, obviously you're not really thinking about that in that moment, like, oh, what is this person thinking and why are they judging me? But you end up feeling kind of like you're the deviant in that situation if you're not drinking, and you have to come up with an excuse. Is it religious? Is it health? Like, are you sick? Are you in recovery? Like, how much do you want to share? And it just becomes a very uncomfortable experience. But when you tie it back to like, what is the person with you who has the drink in their hand experiencing? What we learned was that there was like three themes. Like, one was people who were drinking feel like those who aren't drinking might actually judge them negatively, and that just makes them feel kind of self-conscious, like, oh, you're doing this healthy thing of not drinking and I'm doing this bad thing of drinking, which we probably shouldn't be looking at it either way, but that's how the person might feel. um Also, we know that alcohol is referred to frequently as a social lubricant and all of that. A lot of people feel like it's hard for them to connect socially with other people when they're not drinking together with them. So that just can create like an awkward feeling because it's like something that socially can make people feel connected to one another. And when there's this sort of like disconnect, like I'm doing it, you're not, it just like might not help that sort of experience that the person is seeking to make it easier to connect with people. And then there's this sort of feeling of like, I'm in a situation, I'm drinking, I'm having a good time, and I don't really want to self-reflect in this moment about whether my drinking is problematic. And sometimes when you have someone next to you who's making a different choice, it just can make you self-reflect, like, should I be drinking? And do I drink too much? And often in those social situations, people just don't really want to do that. So they kind of reject that. So I'm bringing all this up because I think for the person who is trying to stay sober for whatever reason, keeping in mind that the reasons that they might be treated in some of those ways that feel very stigmatizing are not really about them. It's probably more about the person who you're standing with. And then for those individuals who are trying to figure out how to be more inclusive, thinking about how does it make you feel when someone you're with is not drinking and you are. And that reflection might actually help someone start their own journey to experiment with not drinking, or even just to understand themselves a little bit better, and think, okay, but for the person who's standing next to me making that choice, it must feel really bad that, I am making judgments about it and acting like it's not the normal thing. So I think that's an important context, I think, for all of us to have about what's my own experience if I am the drinker, what's my own experience if I'm not the drinker in this situation. And if you are a person who is trying to be sober and dealing with all of that, just thinking about how and what you disclose. The study also kind of looked into what's the benefit of self-disclosure in those situations, like I'm trying dry January, or I'm in recovery, or whatever the reason is. You don't owe that to anybody. You certainly don't have to provide that. But people tend to feel like they had the best experience with self-disclosure when the benefits of sharing outweighed the risks for them. So those benefits that people described of being open with certain people were that they could inspire other people. And it is a little bit of an infectious, contagious thing. Like when you're doing something in the interest of your health that feels kind of bold compared to what other people are doing. And it makes you stand out in a way maybe you didn't want to, but it could really help other people to reflect and think, well, maybe I should try that too. Or if the benefits were also maintaining one's own sobriety. Like if you need to disclose in order to like stay strong in that moment and resist the temptation to sort of try to fit in, like your friend did, Hilary, like I think, feeling pressured in that bar, if he was like thinking about, well, you know what, it's really important for me to maintain my sobriety. So I need to out myself about and that sounds stigmatizing in and of itself, but I need to like be open about what I'm doing and maybe why I'm doing it. And also when it helps people build close relationships, because even though that disclosure can be awkward, it can also help build relationships. And I think another thing that you mentioned, Hilary, that really resonates with me is the idea of like not doing it alone. So the more we can be open to groups of people who are not drinking and kind of trying to make a comfortable situation for them, or having events that are incompatible with drinking. So like you found your own way to do that through like having dates in a situation that was incompatible with drinking, where you're exercising and doing fitness activities. But I think we as a society can also think about, how do we create safe spaces for people who drink or don't drink, where what we are sort of designing as a fun activity doesn't always have to be a drinking friendly activity. It could be an activity where drinking just wouldn't fit. And that can promote some other health behaviors as well.
And great points. And I see those activities, those alternative activities, which don't have to be alternative, right? We've been working with a lot of companies here at Shatterproof and trying to create more, inclusive, recovery-friendly workplaces, and have often seen culture change where groups or departments or, coworkers would go out for happy hour and now are going for hikes. And so there is so many other ways to be able to gather. And I think that's great. I also want to share that one of our participants shared that, she's a woman in recovery, and she often gets questioned when she's not drinking if she's pregnant or have fertility treatments going on, which is, again, I think for some reason society's put this pressure on us to question why people don't drink. And I think the more that we can not question that, it's just going to make it so much easier for everyone. So thank you for covering all that. I do want to talk a little bit about the difference between alcohol use and then alcohol use disorder, because drinking doesn't mean you have a disorder, but there are people who do have alcohol use disorder. And so I'd just love to talk a little bit about, if you think a loved one has an alcohol use disorder, what's the best way? First of all, how do you know? Number one, and two, what's the best way to address it? And Dr. Glasner, I'm hoping you can give us some guidance here, because a lot of times we all may know somebody who we think is having a little bit too much to drink, on too many occasions or more frequent occasions than maybe, we would expect. And so I'd love to just get some advice from you, so how we can all think about how to have that conversation with somebody.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is kind of an important call out also for a 30-day sober challenge, because some people may have some safety risk inherent with that, like where going sober, like very abruptly for a 30-day period may not be safe for them because of the level of alcohol use that they are engaged in or how much alcohol they're consuming. Because we know that for there are a lot of substances that you can withdraw from, and it's not like life-threatening necessarily. It's very uncomfortable. Like it's very uncomfortable to withdraw from cannabis. And there is a documented withdrawal syndrome from cannabis. It's very uncomfortable to withdraw from opioids. So uncomfortable that it's often the primary reason that people have such a hard time discontinuing their opioid use because it's so profoundly uncomfortable. But with alcohol use, it can be actually life-threatening, can cause seizures, and in rarer circumstances, can be fatal to go into severe alcohol withdrawal if you are somebody with a severe alcohol use disorder. So I think that is a really important distinction when we talk about something like Dry January. Is like there are some caveats though, and it could be more of an opportunity to recognize, am I somebody with an alcohol use disorder who actually needs like professionally supervised transition off of alcohol or professionally led treatment for an alcohol use disorder. And really the hallmark of an alcohol use disorder, whether or not you have that severe form where you have those dangerous withdrawals, and that's not everybody with alcoholism or a severe alcohol use disorder, but is a subset. It's a loss of control over alcohol use. So there's substance misuse that often gets people to a place where they want to do a Dry January, or even like some people who are doing a Dry January just kind of don't like the health consequences, like things like sleep or hangovers that are just like bad enough that they're kind of disrupting life in some way and really annoying. And maybe some weight gain related to alcohol use that makes people say like, I wonder what life would be like without this. That doesn't mean you have an alcohol use disorder, but it means that maybe your relationship with alcohol could use some work. And that's where it's like a good impetus to try something like a 30-day challenge. But what an alcohol use disorder looks like that's different from that is where you're really progressively losing control over your use of alcohol or another substance, or when we're talking more broadly about substance use disorder. And the ways that you might start to notice that is like, even in the context of something like a sobriety attempt, like you're making certain rules for yourself around how much you're going to drink or what days of the week you're going to drink. And then you find that it's really hard to keep them, even though you're trying. Or it could be that you're starting to notice some health consequences of alcohol that are really unpleasant, like increased anxiety or depression, or there could be physical health consequences that you're starting to notice. And despite the fact that you notice that connection, or you can't pay attention, or your concentration's off, and it's starting to impact the way that you perform in important life areas like your job, or maybe you're having a hard time keeping it together because you're recovering from the effects of alcohol, and that's making it difficult for you to get your kids to school on time, or like there's ways in which it's impacting your functioning, whether it's your health or your ability to perform in important roles in your life, but you find yourself drinking or continuing to use it anyway. So all of those are kind of indicators that you're not really in the driver's seat. I think that's what you're really looking for in order to understand yourself as somebody with an alcohol use disorder. It could also be that there are legal consequences, or like you're doing things when you're under the influence of alcohol that aren't safe. And those are also leading to some life consequences. And then, of course, the quantity you're consuming. Like, so there are these physiological indicators, like you have tolerance, so it takes a lot more for you to get the same kind of buzzed feeling as more than it did before, or that you are starting to experience increasingly intense kind of hangovers that are starting to feel like withdrawal. Maybe you're shaky after, or there are a number of other signs, nausea and, other signs that you can look for. But the key behavior is that, like, despite those things happening, you're coming back to drinking, and it feels like it's not a good choice, but one that you feel compelled to make. So if you or somebody in your life kind of fits that description, as far as what you can do, it kind of depends where you or that person are at with your kind of motivation to make a change, or your sort of insider recognition that alcohol is linked to these problems and that you need to do something about it. So if you or your loved one feel pretty clear on the fact that, okay, I need to do something about it, that's a golden moment. Seize that, and see what type of treatment is available to you. You could talk with a trusted healthcare professional like your primary care provider, or if you have a therapist or someone in the behavioral health space who you can ask, for a recommendation, great. Shatterproof has amazing resources for this. I don't know if you're planning to talk a little bit about Atlas, but I've referred a
You're
lot
welcome to.
of people to the Atlas, which is a treatment finder that Shatterproof has taken years to develop and curate as sort of like evidence-based treatment programs that are really delivering according to the highest standards that we have scientifically for what is effective. Because it can be very overwhelming to navigate, like, how do I figure out what's the best treatment? Like, is this a good treatment program? Are they doing things that work? Like, that's a lot for a lay person who's not really experienced with this whole kind of problem and issue to take on. But Shatterproof has kind of done that for you by doing their research and vetting of different treatment programs to see whether they meet objective standards indicating that they are truly evidence-based. So I would definitely consult the Shatterproof website to seek treatment. But if your loved one just really doesn't have that kind of insight or that recognition, and they don't really seem to be ready to do anything, then it's sort of like gently conversing with them around what concerns you, not being afraid to return to that conversation, and trying to sort of help nudge them to where they'd be willing to talk to a professional. If they're willing to attend a self-help meeting just to see kind of what that's like and what it's about, you could, you could offer to go with them to one. I would just keep the dialogue and the conversation open. And it can be a little bit intimidating to talk to somebody who is defensive or you feel like they're in denial, but you just can't give up.
That's great. Thank you. Hilary, I can imagine, I mean, you've been so open about trying dry January. Is that open conversations with you, with people who feel like they're seeking help or need to change their relationship with
Oh,
alcohol?
absolutely. And I think it's really interesting too, because, especially the first year, and certainly like in the early years that followed, I think there was a lot of pushback from my, circle of friends and a lot of people that I didn't even know who would ask me, why are you doing this? Why is this so important to you if you're going to drink again on February 1st? Or, the more invasive ones like, are you pregnant? Are you sick? Are you on antibiotics? All of the above. And I found that, ironically, a couple years later, it was those same people, that were asking for ideas or tips or saying, I'm trying this, or texting me and saying, I just had a mocktail at the bar. And I think it's interesting. It's definitely a conversation starter. And I think, there have been some individuals that have said, like, I think that, if you're going to give up alcohol, you should just do it altogether, like never drink again. But I think that the truth is that for a lot of people, dry January really is an excuse for people to stop drinking, whether it's for a month or longer. I think that before it wasn't as widespread, and now that everybody pretty much knows what dry January is, they can say like, oh, well, I'm doing this dry January thing. And although they might still receive pushback, it's more commonly and like widely accepted now than it was ever before. And I think that trend will continue. But yeah, to your point, I think that a lot of people have, as my cousin who's a social worker says, everybody comes to her and tells her, everything that she never needed to know. And I think when it comes to drinking, people say the same thing to me. They say, I really need to cut back, or I've been drinking too much. And, over the summer, a friend had said something like that to me. And I said to her, she said she was thinking about going to an AA meeting, and, there was one close by, and I said, I'll go with you. Like, I've never been, I'm happy to accompany you. It took a few times of scheduling and rescheduling, but, we finally went. And I think whether, she decided that AA was the right path for her, or, a different, means to, better understand herself, and her drinking, I think that it definitely gave her a sense of, knowledge about what is out there, and also that there are other people in this shared community who are also, trying to drink less or not drink at all. So to answer your question, yes, it has been a very big conversation starter, and I know more than I think of people and of their drinking habits than I ever expected to know. And yeah, even from people who I've never met on the internet, whether that is a DM on Instagram or an email message. And I do think it's really interesting. A number of years ago, I wrote a piece for the New York Times that was a personal essay about how during, the pandemic, I gave up alcohol for dry January and then continued to not drink because I was, full of anxiety and stress. And I knew that I would feel better if I was not drinking. And from that article, I received, both kind and also aggressive emails from both sides saying, you weren't drinking enough before to give it up, or, you know, basically telling me that like I was drinking too much before. There was no real consensus that was agreeing. But the bottom line is that I did receive an email from a woman who had read my email. And it was very sweet. And 6 months, she said, she was going to give up alcohol, and she realized that she needed to. And so 6 months later, I followed up with her, and actually she followed up with me, and she said that she had been sober for 6 months and she was really, excited about it. And so I followed up with her every year since. And yeah, happy to say that at least one person took the message to heart. So that has been very heartwarming.
That's great. Well, thank you both. I do want to, we had one of our participants had asked about great books, but also made a comment, Dr. Glasner, that somebody stumbled upon your recovery book last year, and it turned out to be the most important resource to help them get through staying sober. They were on the brink of losing a career, home, family due to severe alcohol use, and the book was a pivotal turning point. So, so as I go to the next question, I wanted to share that with you, but each of you have both written books on this. So I highly recommend everybody look at their books, and we'll share those. But are there any other books or resources, podcasts, videos, read, see, hear things that, people may want to turn to, or, that you recommend?
I was going to say, I know that there are a lot of different like self-help books and workbooks, and clearly like the Quit Lit list is certainly growing every year. I would say that actually there are, if you're into like mocktails and things of that nature, I think that a lot of people, obviously miss the social opportunities and also like the creativity that comes with beverages. So I was going to actually recommend a book called Zero Proof. It's a non-alcoholic cocktail book.
All right.
That's so cool. I love that. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the person who shared around the impact of my workbook. That makes all my work worthwhile. So thank you so much for sharing that. Um, there's so much out there. I mean, I know coming from a sciencey background, this may sound like a little bit dry, no pun intended, but I I do really stay close to the websites of the National Institutes on Drug Abuse and the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Both directors, George Koob and Nora Volkow, they write blogs that I find like really interesting around sort of like just the current themes that we're grappling with as addiction scientists, but also just as people. So I would encourage looking at those, but also they have like a lot of educational materials around in their websites around treatments and what's effective and like what's the latest that science is bringing us around these illnesses of substance use disorder and also substance misuse, and also sort of the themes around harm reduction and what we're learning through research around the health impacts of changing your alcohol or other substance use. Another An author who I just really love is David Sheff. He, has written, he's like a really talented journalist and writer. And so you get the perspective both of somebody who can put on his journalistic researcher hat, and really like make clear to his audience what evidence-based treatment is and the science behind addiction, but then he can also talk on a very personal, in a very authentic way, on a very personal level, about his experience in his own family. His book, Beautiful Boy, talks about his, experience with his son's addiction and just the impact it had on him as a father. And I don't know, I find his work very, very moving, very real, and also very informative. So those would be the two that come to mind.
That's great. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us today. I think this has been really, really insightful for me, hopefully for all of our watchers, listeners. And I want to remind everyone it's not too late to try dry. You can visit shatterproof.org /dry January if you want to join our challenge. But this isn't just a January challenge. You're welcome. We have resources all year long to help anybody who decides they want to try dry at any point during the year. We encourage you to stay tuned to our social channels because we're going to definitely be doing more throughout the year, as well as Dry January 2026. And we'll be sharing this recording for those who may not have been able to join us today. So, and I also want to share, we had a lot of resources mentioned today. We'll make sure that that we're sharing those when we post this video with a list of those resources. And you can always visit shatterproof.org. We have a lot of evidence-based resources, no matter where you are in your journey and your relationship with substances, as well as, we do have treatmentatlas.org. So if you do feel like treatment is something that you need to explore or your loved one needs to explore, that is, as Dr. Glasner mentioned, a resource as well. So thank you all. We appreciate you being here today and for being a part of our Shatterproof family. And thanks for everybody who joined us.